Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view. If you've been before, you'll know the routine. If you haven't, what we're going to do is we're going to have a 15-minute introduction from Ed Potts, which I'll deal with in a moment. We'll then open it up for discussion, contributions, questions. We normally like to keep people to 3 minutes, but if you've got a point that needs a bit more development, we'll let that go on. Particularly if you've got any questions or disagreements, contrary points of view, we'll allow those to be developed as well, because differences lead to clarification, hopefully at least. This meeting is being recorded and it will go up on YouTube tomorrow. So if you don't want to be seen, you can turn your camera off. Don't say anything that you will later regret. If you're watching it on YouTube, please press the subscribe button and the like button, and you'll make sure that you get notified of any other videos that we put up, and you'll help spread the message about the existence of talking about socialism from a Marxist point of view. My name is Nick Wrack. I'm one of the organizers of Talking About Socialism. I think all of you will know that Talking About Socialism has been involved in a series of discussions contemplating the possibility of a fusion with two other small groups. One is the Unity faction of the Prometheus online journal, and the other is the Communist Party of Great Britain, which produces the paper The Weekly Worker. We've had 7, I think, meetings so far, and some reports have gone up on our website. We regret that we haven't been able to give a consistent written report because we've all been working, but we're doing our best to keep everybody up to date. This evening's meeting is dedicated to a report and to discussion, questions, clarification, disagreements, and so on about what's going on with the process. And with that in mind, I'm going to now hand over to Ed Potts, who's one of the other organizers of Talking About Socialism, and he's going to take 15 to 20 minutes to report back. So over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Nick, and good evening, comrades. I think I'll start by just re-emphasising some of the general points about this process, because, of course, there are some comrades present tonight who perhaps weren't at our previous meetings where there was a bit of a report done. This process, Forging Communist Unity, really came about in large part at the instigation of TAS, of Talking About Socialism. In effect, we were in receipt of a proposal for what might well have been an interesting series of educational webinars in collaboration with the Weimarks project and with the Prometheus online journal. And our response was to say, effectively, well, we'll see your proposal and we'll raise you one better, which is to actually cut to the chase and say, look, there are clearly here a few organisations advocating quite similar ideas, and it's really an imperative for all communists in favour of a new mass communist party organised democratically to seek unity together with other people advocating the same ideas where at all possible. We don't take anything for granted, but it's certainly something that we feel obliged to explore and to see whether we can achieve the closest unity possible, and of course anything short of that we might be able to do usefully by way of collaboration, which might further our common goals as well. And so really that was where this process came from, and we were very pleased that there was straight away a positive response to it from in particular comrades involved in the CPGB, which puts out the Weekly Worker newspaper, and of course the comrades involved in Prometheus as well. Prometheus is involved by way of a faction on its editorial board, because there was a fairly even split down the middle between comrades who thought that this FCU process represented a real possibility and a real good opportunity, and those who are yet to be convinced and have differences about strategy and where is the best place to put their efforts at the moment. And that argument and that debate will, of course, continue. The most recent meeting of the participants was on the 30th of March. Myself and Nick Wrack attended on behalf of Talking About Socialism, Jack Conrad and Mike McNair for the PCC, and Sam Turner on behalf of the Prometheus Unity faction. To a considerable extent, it was a continuation of discussion that we had gone into in quite some depth in an all-day in-person meeting in London a few weeks before. But no matter how in-depth and long a day that was, we really only scratched the surface of some of the important topics that we have to get into. And so it is clearly a process that's going to take some time. That's no bad thing. We take the process seriously, we're enthused by it, and we're optimistic about the possibilities that it affords. And it follows that we're prepared to give it as much time as it takes to get it right. In general terms, the discussion is still on the topic of fundamental political principles, and especially on the issue of programme. So a programme that a pro-partyist organisation and by extension then a future communist party should adopt. So that's what the current sort of series of discussions is focusing on. This most recent discussion was introduced on the theme of the minimum maximum programme put forward by the comrades in the CPGB, which I'll go into in a little more detail later on. But having at the previous meeting in London, having established that we agree on a substantial amount of fundamental political principles, it was thought that it would be helpful to discuss different approaches to formulating the programme, and the comrades from the CPGB were keen to discuss their preferred approach, so the minimum maximum programme, and with particular conceptions of what belongs in each part. I think it's important to just emphasise to comrades who haven't been present in the discussion, so that it makes sense to you, that a lot of the discussions may seem to be going over ground which perhaps should appear obvious or could be taken for granted amongst communists. But that is deliberate. It is, I think, important that we discuss fundamental principles to make sure that we agree on them, not least because it's easy to think of any number of occasions and examples where this or that person or this or that organisation or trend in the movement adopts a particular position on, say, international affairs, the war in Ukraine, something of that nature, which we think is fundamentally wrong. And clearly, if there was an agreement on fundamental principles there, we didn't understand it in the same way they did. And so it just really emphasises the importance of discussing fundamental principles and not taking anything for granted. We don't hold out agreement on every single little issue as a threshold or a barrier to achieving unity. That's not the purpose of having these discussions. The purpose is that we think, or certainly I think, that if you discuss the fundamentals and get the fundamentals right, everything else flows from that. And the more that you agree on in the first instance, the more likely it is that you can proceed confidently and perhaps more rapidly as well through the rest of the process, because you've identified that there's a substantial level of agreement there between the participants. So in terms of this meeting on the 30th of March, I think the issue that's there in the background that has been running for a few sessions now is a sort of latent disagreement, or disagreement that's coming out into the open now, about the nature of the transition from capitalism to communism. To a lesser extent, or to a secondary extent, that is a disagreement as well about the words that it's appropriate to use and the terminology that it's appropriate to use to describe certain concepts, certain stages in the transition. Both I and Nick as well use the words socialism and communism interchangeably. That's at least part of the reason why this group is called Talking About Socialism, but you may hear me refer more often to communism and communists in discussion. There is no difference in my view. But having said that, it's important to recognise that not everybody uses terminology the same way. Different political groups and individuals with different training and a background in the movement use words to mean different things, and all too often it can be that different uses of the same term, or uses of different terms to mean the same thing, can get in the way of reaching what could otherwise be a proper understanding of each other's position, and even potentially agreement. In this case, the difference is that the weekly worker comrades use the words socialism and communism to refer to two different things. Communism is what might otherwise be referred to the higher phase of communism, the fully realised, emancipated, classless society. And for them, following essentially Lenin's use of the term, they say socialism is something short of that. It's not a mode of production in itself, but it's, as I understand their position, they say, well, socialism is the transition from capitalism to communism. And so there's a difference there, and it's important, insofar as possible, to work through that difference and to not let what might be simply a difference about terminology obscure agreement or disagreement, as the case may be, on the substantive issue, which is actually more important. As I say, though, the fundamental issue there is really about not about the words used, but it's about the nature of the transition. What does it mean for capitalism to be replaced by communism? How might that come about? What do we expect to happen? I think we're all agreed, and participants in the discussion, and maybe this is something that other comrades wish to weigh in on tonight. It's pointless to gaze into a crystal ball and say, well, on this week of the revolution, the working class will do X, Y, and Z, and therefore we can expect by this calendar date the revolution will have reached this stage of completeness. I think everybody would accept and concede that that's futile. But the difference, really, in a nutshell, is that the weekly worker comrades, the CPGB comrades, appear to be arguing that it's more likely than not that there will be a substantial period of transition between capitalism and communism, and that during that time, various facets of capitalist society, like wage labour, private ownership of some of the means of production, and so on, will persist, and that's not a problem, as it were, for the plan, because we can assume that the transition will take place nevertheless. My position, I'll speak only for myself, because I don't want to presume that everybody or even anybody necessarily agrees with me. My position is that potentially misunderstands a few things. One is the logic and the dynamics of the working class coming to power, the extent to which the working class, if it is to raise itself to the position of the ruling class in society and win the battle for democracy, as Marx had it, its economic strength is very likely to be increasing in tandem with that. And it will, as it approaches political power, be ever more in a position to implement its economic programme. I think the other issue with the CPGB's position, the criticism I would make of it, is that it, to a certain extent, really defies the logic of the working class in power, because my argument would be, well, if look, the working class take power, why would certain sections of the working class, or indeed the working class as a whole, be prepared to tolerate the persistence of a long transition in which various sections of the working class are still obliged to go and toil for a boss, to undertake wage labour, in which their labour is not serving them or wider society, but is still serving the interests of profit for a few. Isn't it more likely that once unleashed by the conquest of political power, that the working class will see it as their task to immediately or as quickly as humanly possible to implement their programme, which is, of course, the socialisation of the economy and the reshaping of society to meet human need rather than profit. It may yet be that there is still an agreement to be reached, or a better understanding of each other's positions in this process, but I think we're not there yet. And I think one of the things it's incumbent on, certainly on me to do, is to set out my position in writing and to write an article about it, so that what I'm arguing it is a bit clearer. But that, in a nutshell, I think is the nature of the disagreement. Set against that as well, there's also this idea of the working class being in power. What does that mean? Is it simply the working class conquering political power without that implying necessarily about what it does to the economy or how long it takes to do anything to the economy? Or does something fundamentally in society need to change beyond who's controlling, who has the hands on the political levers? Does that need to change in order for the working class to truly be in power? I would say that the root of course, I think we all agree, the root of working class oppression within capitalist society is its economic circumstances, its separation from the means of production, and therefore, unless and until you attack that and change that, is the working class actually in power? I think there's a big question mark over that. So I think those are some of the key differences which continue to be brought to the surface. I would commend to everybody Nick's article, which has been published on the TAS website, which is titled FCU Dealing with Differences. I think that does a good job of making clear some of the arguments, and I can see that some comrades present tonight have already engaged with it, which I think is very positive. So I'm just going to finish there, I think, just by once again saying I think there's a lot to be enthusiastic about in this process. I think that the discussion of differences and the emergence of differences is not a negative necessarily, and certainly not something that we should be worried about, but rather those differences should be discussed as widely as possible and in as much detail as possible, because that is something that the communist movement has historically done very poorly at, to its detriment. The more fully we understand our ideas and our programme and are prepared to defend them, and are better equipped to take them out to the masses, the better we will do as a movement, and the more prepared we will be for building our movement and indeed building the mass communist party that we all need. So I'll finish there. I think I've spoken long enough.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that very succinct and all-encompassing introduction. What I'm going to do now is ask people to raise the yellow hand, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find it, wave vigorously into your camera, and if I don't see it, somebody else will draw your hand to my attention. It's important to know that, or to understand that we like questions. Whatever you think, you may be hesitant to ask what you think is an obvious question, or a question that you think other people think is obvious, but all questions are important, all questions are valid, and all points of difference are welcome. So who wants to contribute first? And don't hold back, because we've only got another 45 minutes of, well, another hour of discussion. So Peter Kennedy, thank you.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Great, yeah. I couldn't find the hands thing to go up, you know. The yeah, I know. Yeah, thanks a lot, Edmund, is it? Yeah, for putting forward that what's been talked about between TAS, Prometheus, and CPGB. I was just wondering whether, when as you're talking, I'm thinking, is there any kind of like a particular reason why the three groups consider them fusion? Are they kind of closer together than other groups on the left? Because we can all like go through the list. I wrote it out. Socialist Party, Socialist Workers' Party, Communist Party of Britain, Communist Party of GB, which you just mentioned, Revolutionary Communist Party, trades unions and Socialist Coalition, Workers' Power, and so on. So I'm wondering what makes the three kind of like fit together, so that there's a kind of rationale and the the time and attention that it's taken is worthwhile. I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm just saying, is there an affinity there? That's all. And the other thing is, when you were discussing the differences, the beginnings of the differences, and that got me thinking that, well, and they're fundamental differences. What you were saying about transition from socialism to communism, from capitalism to socialism, where communism fits in that as a stage, with its higher and lower and all this thing that we used to talk about. The fundamental ones, but they're also important ones, the core ones. And so I'm wondering whether, if we did get together, I said but if the three fused into a party, then wouldn't it be replicated when we're talking to other parties then? We're a party now, we have principles, and we've worked out or ironed out, loosely anyway, this social transition, from capitalism to socialism, communism, in a rough sense, and overcome other certain differences, which you didn't go into, but I'm sure there's others. Wouldn't we be kind of meeting those hurdles straight away? And that gets me thinking more to, well, what kind of organization maybe people should be working towards? And it strikes me that a party kind of puts people off that we maybe want to attract, while there's a necessity for a party at the same time. And maybe it's some sort, whatever you call a fusion, communist futures, communist group movement, communist front. I don't know. I'm not gifted in terms of like the fancy language that you could do to kind of brand this, but nevertheless, maybe that's the kind of grouping or network, that open access kind of organization, where we can have this debate out with a multiple of parties about what socialism means and the transition. Because the other thing is that these things are kind of dependent on what we take to be capitalism right now, how it's evolved, at what stage it's at what stage the class struggle is at. And, so that's going to kind of like shape how we define our principles, including how we think about transitional things, whether we think, for example, that Trotsky stuff about permanent revolution is old hat and needs to be kicked into the bin, or whether we need to dust it down and maybe see that in the prism of talking about minimum maximum programs, instead of like we have one bin called the minimum program, and then we have another one. We put all the policies into the maximum, and there doesn't seem to be any mediation there. So there's a lot to discuss, and I'm thinking that even if you were successful, I suppose, I'll leave it at that, then there's still the barriers with other parties or exactly the same principles. And I don't mean that in a negative term. I'm just trying to be realistic and, and not kind of like create barriers where they need not necessarily be.
Thanks, Peter. That's really good opening for the discussion. I'm sure the people that want to come in and either disagree or develop those points. And I see who's next who wants to come in. I know there are people that have lots to say. Nick Rogers.
So I won't discuss the fusion project or because I haven't been engaged with that, and so I can't really comment on that as things stand. I have seen I read the article which Nick Wrack wrote on the meeting you had last week, a week or so ago, and there was Nick posted that on his Facebook page, and there's been some debate on there which I've participated in with Marcus Strom, who's in Australia, Australian Marxist, who was a member of the CPGB's Provisional Central Committee when he was here, and who I know. And I used to be a member of the CPGB myself for 5 years until 2011, and I participated in. They were redrafting the program at that stage, and I participated. I was a sort of dissident as far as the program then was concerned, and wrote quite a few articles for the Weekly Worker and so on. And the key issue of difference in the end turned around the point which Ed has raised about the nature of the transition and the terminology that we use. So I've written, and in the years since I've engaged with that issue, not specifically on the CPGB's take on it, but so on. So I'm interested in that, and I would say that Ed has captured the key issue, which kind of is what the length of the transition to a new society or a new mode of production. Because if those of us who were around when the Soviet Union was in place will remember that it was part of the Soviet Union's ideology that they were at the stage of socialism, that they'd nationalized the economy and so on, but that they hadn't achieved the full communism as it was described, which would enable them to get rid of the state and distribute all products freely and so on. So it's a distributional thing, but it also had a bearing on the continued existence of the state and so on. Understanding that Marx and Engels had believed that as soon as you go beyond a class society, then the existence of a state defined as an instrument of class rule becomes defunct. And so, but they put it off so far into the future, although Khrushchev actually in 1960, end of the 1950s, was saying that the Soviet Union would achieve communism by 1980. I don't think that he actually envisaged that they'd even get rid of the state then, and it would then be communism in one country. So anyway, so that is the issue. That is the core of the issue that I have with the CPGB's approach. That if you're talking about an objective which is way in the future, decades, possibly hundreds of years in the future. At one stage, Mike McNair was saying that communism, he believed, would take 1 to 200 years to be achieved. So you're talking about something beyond the lifetime of anyone who's around now. So I just think that's ridiculous. You've got no way of knowing what's going to happen over that kind of time, over that kind of time scale. I think we owe it to those we represent, to the working class, to say what we're going to achieve, what we think the working class can achieve over the course at the very most, the active lifetime of someone who's a young adult when the revolution takes place. So, what do you envisage happening over the next 40 to 50 years? And I think things such as the expropriation of the capitalist class, that will happen automatically, sort of in the aftermath of a revolution. So I agree with Ed on that as well. That if the working class takes political power, why do we conceive that they're going to allow exploitation and class oppression in the workplace to continue and so on? All of those relationships are going to be transformed. So that's what I would argue. I could go into a lot more depth on this,
Yeah,
but
but not now, Nick.
we obviously haven't got time.
Yeah, no. To anybody that's listening or wants to read further, I'd recommend Nick's articles on this subject that you'll find if you Google him or look on the Weekly Worker website from 2010, 2011. Points that he makes in his articles are very, very relevant. And we're going to be sharing a couple of his articles on our website. So look out for those. I'm going to call him Barry now, but please don't feel that you have to make contributions that are very long. Come in with just simple questions if you want something answering. Barry, over to you. That's it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, Barry.
Okay. I think Ed talked for quite a while about language barriers. Now, I think I agree with Nick and John that I'm sorry, and Peter. I agree with Nick and Peter that these are fundamental differences about transition. It's not a language barrier. It's a political barrier. I think it's the difference between less social democracy and communism. The difference over the transition. I mean, it's clear from the discussions that the CPGB leadership see a clean break with capitalism or expropriation of capitalists to be utopian. They're quite clear about this, that they don't think you can do that. Their alternative is to manage capitalism and the state, which I don't think is a communist position. Because if you manage capitalism and you manage the state, then I think what's happening there is that how can you then represent the working class when you're managing capitalism and the state? You can't do that. And we saw that in the USSR, didn't we? Where a new exploiting class crystallized around the party and the state apparatus. and also their reluctance to abandon the phraseology of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, I think from very early of the history of the Bolshevik Party, I think Plekhanov and Lenin were putting the dictatorship of the proletariat into the framework of a government and a state, rather than the democratic rule of the working class. And I think that view is again, I think, wrong. That they shouldn't be objecting to dropping the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat, because all it means is the rule of the majority of workers. I think in his drafts on the Paris Commune, Marx made that quite clear, didn't he? That it would be the rule of the working class, the majority of the working class, and not simply a state or government. In fact, of course, he said it was a revolution against the state itself, where the state and its functions would be absorbed into society, into the working class organizations. So I could make more points, but I'll just finish by saying that I don't think it helps if you just believe that it's a language problem or a terminology problem, because that's fudging fundamental differences. And I think Peter's point is a good one, that why CPGB when there is such a fundamental difference?
Good question to end on there, Barry. Thank you. Who's going to come in next?
Nick, a couple of us.
Lawrence. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see my screen's not big enough to get everybody in, so I'm going to call in Lawrence.
Soraya before me. She may have been before me.
Yeah, I'm going to call Lawrence. So I'm going to chair you in first.
All right.
Call Soraya.
Okay. Yeah. I think I think that there is a reason that these fusion talks are happening with the CPGB and Prometheus. It's because we've talked a lot about the disagreements, but there are quite a lot of agreement as well. And one of the fundamental ones to those people who are questioning why these fusion or beginning to raise questions about the whys and wherefores of this fusion process, there is quite a lot of agreement between the three participants. And there's one fundamental point of agreement, which is the formation of a mass communist party, multifactional, that's open and does its debating in front of the working class rather than behind it. And that is a fundamental difference. Peter gave the list of organizations. Most of the organizations on that list don't have that strategy. And I don't think having networks or broad lefts or anything like that is a plausible strategy either, because we've kind of discussed that quite a lot on this kind of forum and why those kind of things don't work. So there is a reason why the three groups are debating and talking about fusion, and I think that shouldn't be lost in all this. However, I do think the issue of the transition is an important one, and by and large, with this or that nuance, like I kind of agree with Nick's writings on this in the past, and I agree largely with what Ed said. Quibbles kind of apart on it, but the one thing I think that ought to kind of be remembered in this is that the reason why the CPGB seemingly have this is perfectly true. I found the article where Mike McNair from 2008, where he talks about a transition. He speculates about a transition that maybe lasts hundreds of years. So on that level, China will get to socialism or communism before we will. But leaving that aside, why do the CPGB argue? Where did it come from? Well, I think there is a certain historical kind of legacy in the, various organizations in the official communist movement clung on to this idea of socialism being the lowest stage, because obviously they had a very stagist conception of the revolution. The British road to socialism, succession of Labour governments, then you go into socialism, and then finally you get to communism. So that partly where it comes from, but the root of it inside the CPGB, which left the official communist movement like a long time ago. We're talking about the Weekly Worker Group. It actually came out of a polemic inside their organization, and a polemic which actually was quite kind of useful. They had to deal with a lot of members, a group of members, quite a few of which I knew, who were always very militaristic, very fixed on their ideas, like the combat party, very addicted to kind of the idea of violent revolution, and a kind of macho, kind of strutting, kind of posturing kind of way of approaching the world, and a very kind of how would you say, yeah, just a very, what we would call old-fashioned Leninist, die with your boots on, that type of kind of thing. And the polemic they had in their organization with those people was to say that raising up an old slogan, of Marx, which is, we make the revolution peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must. And obviously, the CPGB developed, the idea in that revolution is not always put your hands around somebody's throat and throttling them for 24 hours a day. That there are moments that there's ebbs and flows in the class struggle, and there is actually quite a lot you could achieve through peaceful means, albeit you need to be armed. So that was a useful discussion with those comrades inside their own organization. And it was probably me when I was a kid. They were arguing with people like headbangers like me when I was a kid about that type of stuff. That was a useful kind of learning process. But what you find with the CPGB, like any other of the small groups we could mention, where you try and transpose that kind of polemical struggle inside a very small group, when you try and make that operative in the world and use that as a basis for a program for communism, you can kind of see that those kind of bend in the stick polemical points don't work very well. And it's clear what people like Mike and John and the CPG leadership have done. They've taken a polemical point where they were bending the stick, in their terminology, not mine, like, towards this idea of the peaceful revolution and this idea of consensus, and also dealing with the fact that, a lot of the fallout of the collapse of Stalinism made all that stuff the ideas of violent revolutions and dictatorships very, very unfashionable. So this is where this is where a lot of this kind of stuff came from. And it's what I get when I read their program. I've said this to Nick. It's like a bit like reading archaeology. You can read all these sediments and layers that were all based upon squabbles and internal debates that they had in their organization. Now, they may have been useful in their time and in their place, and I suspect, some of it was useful, some of it less so. But I don't think you can just transpose all that stuff from intra-sect struggles into like programs for the working class. How the hell are we going to inspire the mass of the working class to take power if you're talking about that type of time gap? I will say though, I don't think any of us believe in an instant overnight revolution, overnight communism, which we've kind of been accused of recently. I've noticed that we're ultimatists, that we want an instant revolution. I've even comrades even got accused of being like Pol Pot's Kampuchea and all this nonsense. So there is this fair amount of nonsense that's gone along with this and stereotyping. But that's it. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. Soraya.
Just a few points. And other comrades have already touched on this, but I think we need a party rather than a conglomeration of separate organisations, because with a common purpose. Because when I say a party, we aren't going to build the Communist Party with a small group of people, but it's important that it is an organisation, one organisation, rather than a grouping of different organisations. And I say that because otherwise each group has competing interests. It's trying to build its own little group, and it actually there isn't much unity. I think that it's important to be one party, one, whatever you want to call yourself. I think we should call ourselves a party without being too grandiose, but at the beginning of a party, something that's aiming to build a much bigger party. It's been very interesting and informative to hear other comrades who've got more experience and explaining what positions have been in the past and probably still are now. Is this an issue that is a bar to unity? It may not be, but I think it's important that it's discussed. I mean, I think, I mean, nobody's saying it isn't important. It must be surely axiomatic that you don't take power to manage capitalism better. I mean, I don't even begin to understand this business about it would take 1 to 200 years to achieve communism, because otherwise, what's the point of taking power? It's as the comrades just said, it's not a question of thinking, oh, well, overnight you're going to have everything sorted, but it's not. You're not taking power. The working class aren't going to take power to manage capitalism better. And capitalism is not going to allow a position where they sort of hand over control, because they're constantly trying to undermine losing their power. Just on the question of the choice of words, using language which was a translation in many cases, of course, if you're talking about Marx or Lenin or Trotsky, a translation of an original language, which may not have been a particularly good translation in the first place, but then using archaic language is not a way to move forward, in my view. It would be crazy to use the word dictatorship. You can't ignore fascism. You can't ignore dictatorships, what it means. It does not mean a democracy, and I don't mean a bourgeois democracy. It just does not mean democracy in any way. So the idea of saying, oh, well, this was used and therefore we're going to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, I just think is crazy, and is going to would alienate people rather than actually enthusing people with the idea of workers organising society in a democratic way. So just a few thoughts.
Thanks very much, Soraya. Can I see if there's anybody else who hasn't spoken who wants to come in? Kate.
Oh, right. Okay. If I unmuted properly?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Kate, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Right. It's just really a question, because I just find it's like it's way above my head. But I just wanted to ask about the working class taking power, right? I don't see the working class as one kind of homogenous group. I see it as sections of the working class. Some are more disempowered than others. And how does that work when you have socialism? And I was reading Kirsty's article on disability, and I just found it very inspiring that there's another person who's disabled who comes to these talks, because of the oppression of disabled people and the place we are in the hierarchy, and because a lot of us aren't engaged in wage work, and this whole thing is about economics, and the work being there change from being exploitation to be something that is part of workers' control and everything. So that's, I know it's not kind of a question about all this merger, but it's a really big question for me. So anyone wants to answer it, that would be great.
Thanks very much, Kate. If I may, I'm going to come in myself. Oh, Minnie, sorry, I'll take you first, Minnie.
Yeah, just in response to Kate, I was inspired by Kirsty's article as well. And I take your point, Kate, about obviously different sections of the working class, but that is the ruling class playing divide and rule and doing it deliberately. So whatever party we have, this mass party has to be deeply democratic. And it's not just about economics, it's about the politics, isn't it? And setting up a proper democracy. And it's not just about workers, it's about, ex-workers, retired people, members of the community, carers, disabled people. It's about everyone. And this party really does it needs to be open to everyone, and a party of the working class as a whole. It's got to be about that. I think that really, it's been some really good points made so far. And I agree about was it Barry saying it's about more than terminology, really, isn't it? It's a fundamental difference that's happened. I mean, because is it your piece with the CPGB? I read your article, Nick. I thought it was really good. Yeah, and when Mike McNair expostulated a fundamental break with capitalism, what the fuck is that? Well, surely that's what a mass communist party would be there to do. I'm not saying you could abolish money straight away, but surely the value system that divides and rules, that expropriates people, that would have to be worked around. And obviously you would abolish wages eventually, but not wages in terms of, the bosses decide who gets what, etc., etc. The bosses, we don't want bosses. We want workers and communities running production, an association of producers. One interesting thing that I think, I put it on the Facebook page that happened recently, that we talk about technology a lot, and I know Nick made this point on a meeting a week or so ago, and I've thought about this a lot as well, that we're the working class and we basically run everything anyway, and a big part of this revolution is going to be technology, and the technologies so we need to, as a mass working class party, we need to have groups working on everything, disability, food production, climate change, what we're going to do. We need loads and loads of groups and different factions all working to come together with a big plan. Obviously, it also depends on the situation across the world, across Europe. But there's one really big thing is tech and AI, etc. And on Facebook recently, there's been a post, I put it on Talking About Socialism, but there's a professor, he's called Geoffrey Hinton, he's a professor of AI, and he was on Robert Peston's program. He's deeply concerned about AI and how it could take over. They've got what could happen, and Robert Peston asked him, how do we make sure that the productivity gains from AI are properly distributed rather than just going to billionaires and we get out of stagnating living standards for ordinary people? And this is his answer. I'm just going to put it on now. This is Professor Geoffrey Hinton, is a Canadian British. He was working at Toronto Uni. So I'll just put it on now. Let me just put my sound on.
Productivity gain may not,
just give me a second,
be fairly distributed among citizens, and it could again simply accrue to a few owners, a few billionaires at the top. How do we make sure that these gains are properly distributed and we get out of this awful slump of stagnating living standards?
On socialism.
It's just as simple as that, is it? Where you just need proper socialist leadership. Yep. Okay.
Okay, that's it.
That's great. Thanks very much, Kirsty. Minnie, rather.
Yeah, that's me
I
for
mean,
now.
I meant that stopped them in the tracks. Thanks a lot. Um, so I'm going to chair myself in, if I may, and just try and deal briefly with some of the questions that have come up. So, first of all, on Peter and Barry, I agree with a lot of what you both said. But in answer to the question why these groups and not others, well, partly it is, as Lawrence said, we have a lot in common, as well as some of the differences that are arising. Some people might have been more aware of the differences than certainly than I was, in terms of until they started coming out more starkly. But we do have a lot in common in the broad politics, and I think one of the things that's attracted a layer of people is the emphasis on democracy and the democratic aspect of Marx, which I think is important and is largely ignored, certainly in the general propaganda by other groups. And so there were reasons why we came together, and the other practical and important reason is, we as TAS, one of the things that we set out to do when we started having these discussions, we said that we want to find allies in creating a bigger group who see the importance of a mass communist party in which ideas and differences could be discussed openly. But of course, you have to have the ability to agree on particular action, and you have to agree on a program. And what goes into your program is important, and it may actually affect your political work. So whether these differences are fundamental, I'm inclined to think that they are more fundamental than terminological, because they have consequences. But we don't want to simply cast aside these discussions. We want to investigate and explore, and in the course of that, see whether there can be a reconciliation, whether there can be agreement, not glossing over differences, but trying to find, well, let's hope we can persuade one another, putting it bluntly. If there are people here who think that fusing is important, and we get a bigger mass of communists who want to build a mass communist party, then you should join TAS and get involved in TAS and help to develop our work, our politics, and our contribution to the fusion process. I've set out in my article my approach, which is broadly similar, if not completely overlapping with what Ed said, and does raise a lot of the points that Barry and Peter and Nick Rogers have raised. What is the point of the working class coming to power unless it's to expropriate the ruling class, the current ruling class? Now, that doesn't mean that it can be achieved overnight, but the only way that you can get to a classless society is by abolishing classes. And you can't abolish classes unless you get rid of the capitalist class. That means turning everybody into a worker. And that means socializing the means of production. And when everybody is a worker and there are no bosses, there are no classes. And the consequence of that, as Marx and Engels pointed out, is that you do not need a state when you have no classes, because a state is an instrument of rule of one class over the other. You have, in my opinion, you're following classical Marxism of Marx and Engels. I mean, Engels wrote a book, Anti-Dühring, and he turned it into a pamphlet called Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. And it was written and published while Marx was still alive. So the idea that Marx disagreed with it, I find incredible. It couldn't be the case. Engels sets it out very, very simple, that the working class comes to power. It expropriates the bourgeoisie. It has a state, but it's a different state, because the bourgeois state is smashed You have a new type of state, which Barry referred to as the commune type of state, looking at the experience of the Paris Commune. But there's a fundamental difference in the revolution that takes place compared with, say, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, or slavery to feudalism, or any such similar. In those previous transitions, it's always been a minority class that comes to power. And a minority class needs a very oppressive state, or at least the backdrop of a repressive state to enforce its rule. The working class coming to power, for the first time, it's the most democratic event in history. The working class, the majority, billions and billions of people worldwide come to rule. And in my opinion, a transition then of expunging the rule of the ruling class would be relatively simple. I'm not saying we don't have to think out the detail and iron out the wrinkles and so on, but the power of the international working class is immense. And we're not talking about a working class that constituted 17% of Russia in 1917. We're talking about a huge, immense working class in every single part of the world, which is largely educated and attuned to technology and has all sorts of skills which could transform society almost overnight. I'm sure I'll be quoted out of context in saying that. But so therefore, the need of a state, once classes have disappeared, a state would disappear. There would be no state. And what we would have is humanity running itself. I've tried to explain in my article, and I'd welcome feedback, I welcome disagreement and criticism. I've tried to emphasize in my article that the program that we're putting forward, or that we argue for as a mass communist party, is not the program of the party per se. It's the program for the class. And the class has to implement it. And you know, if the class agrees with it and takes it up, it will implement. And if the working class comes to power, in my opinion, I don't see how the working class in a small business will tolerate being told what to do by the small proprietor, and continue to be exploited for the benefit of that small proprietor any more than a worker in a large conglomerate. So clearly there are nuances and things to iron out. But the fundamental points that we're trying to convey about communism and the transition to communism are really, really important. Having said that, I don't wish to minimize or understate the importance of the words. In these discussions, we have had to, in a sense, almost fight through the differences of the way terminology is used. And so sometimes it can appear, I think, to comrades from the CPGB that perhaps we're a bit backward and we don't really understand. So I asked in the last meeting whether they agreed with Comrade Mark Mulholland on his interpretation of what the minimum program was. And it was reported almost as if I didn't know what the minimum program was. I do know what the minimum program is. I have a good understanding of it. I wanted to know what they thought of it and to see whether it was the same as my interpretation, because quite often the points are not the same. I've said in these meetings, and I'm speaking only for myself, I don't know whether Ed agrees or not. Perhaps he can say, I think the whole question of whether it's a minimum maximum program, whether it's a transitional program, I think this all gets in the way. It gets in the way of what we're trying to convey. We should be conveying in simple language what the working class would need to do on coming to power. And that's what we stand for. And so we put that in easy, readily intelligible, easy to understand language that any worker or young person can say, yes, that's what I want. And that's, if we get the chance, that's what I would want to implement. And I think any suggestion that we would tolerate for any significant period of time sections of the capitalist class to continue to exploit workers and use that position potentially to undermine the gains of the revolution, then I think that that is ludicrous. It's crazy. It's bonkers. Just going back to Peter's point, why these groups? Well, I've tried to explain that, but the other side of that coin is that none of the other organizations would even consider discussing the idea of fusing with another party. We have to ask the question of the militants in those organizations, the RCP, the Socialist Party of England and Wales, Socialist Alternative, the SWP, why are you not demanding of your leadership the idea of fusion of your parties into one big communist party or socialist party? Why not? Why do you each think that you've got the better idea? What is it? And so I think that that's something that we've got to challenge. The idea that, basically we've got, umpteen one true path to God, or umpteen one true path to revolution. And we need the parties, any genuine, serious communist, to overcome the differences, because quite often, in fact, most often, they're not serious differences. It may well be that this question of the transition turns out to be more important than some of the differences that there are between groups on other points. We'll find that out as we continue discussing. But at the moment, these fusion discussions are being looked at, they're being followed, people are interested, people want them to work. So we're going to pursue them, depending on what the members of TAS say. But we want them to work, and we want to achieve something. So we want your help in making that happen. I'm going to finish my own contribution there. I'm going to come back to Kate, who's got a hand up. Kate?
Yeah. So what I want to say, Nick, you said, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. You said everyone has to become a worker. So my view is the whole definition of work would need to change because of this inequality within sections of the working class. A lot of work that's really fundamental to our survival is not waged and not paid for. And at the moment, I think that increases the oppression of people who are doing it, and predominantly, say, women are doing the majority of raising children, which is life enhancing, in caring for people who are disabled. Disabled people are also caring for themselves to stay alive, and the situation for older people as well. So, I mean, and also I think that the work of undocumented migrants is not recognised either, and that's how a lot of the economy functions. So that's under capitalism. But I actually think if it's going to change, then there has to be a discussion and an acknowledgement of that situation. I don't know how it will work, because you say there won't be any bosses eventually and there won't be a wages system, but I just really think that that is totally fundamental. So that's just what I want to say.
Thanks, Kate. I think that's a great point, because our aim is of communism, from each according to their ability, which takes into account the different abilities, to each according to their needs, and they can be profoundly different. I'm going to ask Nick Rogers to come in, and then Soraya, and then I'm going to hand over to Ed.
I want to briefly come back on what Kate said, because I absolutely agree. We're talking about society in which work takes on a different meaning, really, from what it does now, because it's an oppressive thing now for lots of people. Some people enjoy their work, I guess, but for lots of people, it's something they would rather they did not have to do, and it's oppressive and so on. So I think one of the fundamental things we need to change, and it needs to change quickly and not 200 years in the future, is the way that work's organised, what is valued as work. And you're quite right that I think the caring work will become increasingly more important. And I hate the idea of some people who are really big on technology and automation and all of this, talking about getting rid of human beings from education or health or caring even. I think that's a very dystopian idea of the future, and I think that we need to make every being part of society and contributing to society will be an important part of what people want to do, I think.
Thanks very much, Nick. Soraya?
Yeah, again, just coming back on what Kate was saying, I think we need to explain in our material, if it isn't clear, that people who are carers, don't get paid for the work they do, are part of the working class, not in the sense of necessarily perhaps you could see directly exploited, but actually, if you think about it, they are being exploited by capitalism because it is unpaid work, isn't it? That should be people who are carers don't get any money. It's a cheap way of this, so the state doesn't have to pay. I'm not saying that people don't care and that people don't look after, for example, family members and so on, and necessarily don't want to do it. But at the moment, a lot of people don't have the choice. And really, it should be something that is part of the way society is organised. So I think people who aren't, and when I say carers, I mean people who look after their children and so forth. That for me, they are all part of the working class and contribute to society. And so we need to make that that clear in our material and explain it. And then, of course, the whole question about how society is organised afterwards is a different issue.
Yeah, there's a whole debate to be had about the nature of work and how it must change under communism, and comparing and contrasting it perhaps with the way that work was looked at in the past by communists, who simply, in many occasions, many works saw it simply as the working class taking over, but continuing production in the same way as production was undertaken under capitalism. Anyway, that's perhaps a different discussion for a different time. Ed, are you ready to come back?
Sure.
Thanks, fire away.
So, first of all, thanks very much to all comrades who've contributed and asked questions. I can't possibly respond to everything. Can I just start by answering as best I can Kate's question that she asked a little while ago, because it's actually quite important to the this question that we've raised as one of the key potential differences. Well, what does it mean for the working class to take power? And Kate said, I don't see them as one homogenous group. You have different sections. How does that work under socialism? And of course, you raised, for example, disabled people as being one section of the working class. I think it's important to remember that the ruling class, the capitalist class, are also not homogenous. They are tied to and divided between different competing nations, different competing companies, different competing industries. There are differences on a personal level between them. There are different political allegiances. One section of the ruling class may be more liberal, the other more conservative and right-wing. And yet they manage to rule society together more or less as a whole. Well, how do they do it? They do it effectively by running society as a cabal. The strong tend to prevail over the weak, and we see that in particular. Strong ruling classes of particularly strong nations prevail over the weaker ruling classes of others. They deploy underhand methods and subversion. They spy on each other, sometimes where there are fundamental differences or irreconcilable differences, if you like, between this or that nation or this or that faction. Well, then they have to spill over into war. whether tariff wars at the moment or actual war. And then in the periods of notional peacetime, obviously they have to do a lot of their working things out and reaching agreements behind closed doors, because they rule society as a minority. So they rule over society as a minority, and that depends on them keeping their rule to a certain extent obscured from view. And the flip side of that is working class rule over society, which is going to be open and democratic, and it's going to involve democratic representation of the differences within and the different sections of the working class. So in contrast to the capitalist class, where it's really dog eat dog within that class, in contrast, the working class has an interest in political representation of itself as a whole and the differences within it, because it's only through accommodating those differences and providing that representation that the class as a whole can rule society democratically as the majority. So I think that's the crucial difference. I would agree completely with the point that Lawrence raised in answer to Peter. I thought Peter's question about, well, look, why these groups, why this fusion process, that is completely valid and a very helpful question. And I completely agreed with Lawrence's answer to that, which I think Nick, to some extent, agreed with as well. The key problem and the key area of disagreement that we have at the moment with the existing organisations of the revolutionary left, and in particular their leaderships, rather than necessarily all of their members, because again, not homogenous. But the key difference we have with them is that we think the model of organisation that they pursue does not work, does not achieve its stated aims, and cannot succeed in constructing the sort of mass party that we want to see. And we don't simply want to tear those organisations down to no purpose. So we're not waging a campaign of hostility against them. We want to be part of replacing them ultimately with something better. And certainly for my part, I think that they certainly can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And so that's the key difference between us. I think if there was any opening or any possibility of discussions with, for example, comrades in the Revolutionary Communist Party, then I would jump at the chance, and I would feel it was just common sense to engage with that. It would certainly be a big task, even much bigger than the task that we have on our hands right now with this much smaller scale recruitment process. But I think the two are indivisible. I think if you committed seriously to unity because of the imperative towards unity that our politics really places on us, and the obligation to pursue that, then you have to try and take whatever's on offer, assuming it's worth having. I guess that flows nicely into Barry's comments. I certainly agree that it's important not to fudge things under the cover of language, but I respectfully disagree that's what's going on, or certainly the approach that I'm taking. I think it's really worth, comrades, I know that Barry has read it, and I think it's worth, if anybody hasn't read it, just returning to the report of the in-person meeting that I did. It's on the TAS website. I'll place it in the chat just so that comrades have it, because what that shows is that we, Nick and I and Soraya drafted, as a contribution to the discussion, an opening gambit, if you like, 17 suggested heads of agreement. So a statement of fundamental principles. They thought, let's see if we get agreement on this. And the participants in that meeting in London a few weeks back agreed with 14, I think, out of the 17. Apologies if I've got the number wrong, but it's something in that region. And so there is really quite a lot of agreement there, and it's important not to lose sight of it. That doesn't mean, of course, that you just then gloss over the areas where you disagree. But there's the question of method, how you approach those disagreements. And I think my thinking on it goes something like this. Look, first of all, do we say different things about this or that issue? Second, despite the fact that we say different things, do we in fact mean different things? Because it might be thought that if there is just a simple, pure difference of terminology, that may be far less important. There are, I think, certain words and terms which are really important to avoid. Dictatorship has been raised as one. I think that that's, for the most part, really unhelpful. But where it's a simple difference, well, we say A, we say B, there's not much to choose between them. Does that need to be such an issue? And then you move on. Well, look, if there is actually a substantive difference, how significant is it? Is there a chance that through discussion and working through the problem, can we actually change our positions, develop our positions so that we reach a closer level of agreement than we have right now? If there are still disagreements at the end of that, do they need to be a barrier to unity? And if they, even if they are a barrier to unity at this stage, well, with that obligation, if you like, to pursue the greatest possible unity of communist forces on a principled basis, what do we do then? If we can't achieve unity right now, what do we do then? So that's my thinking on it, and that's what I'm trying to implement as a method. But of course, I'm not in there just arguing as an individual. I'm trying not to just argue as an individual, but rather to, of course, represent task members and, of course, argue in such a way that's productive for the forces outside the room who are looking on and hopefully will see something in this process that could lead to a new organisation which is greater than the sum of the parts we have right now, that represents the opportunity for something qualitatively better and may well join a new fused organisation at the end of it. And so I welcome criticism on this kind of thing. If comrades feel that I've got things wrong, if I haven't really understood or appreciated the differences, if I'm giving too much away, giving too much ground on this or that issue, that is certainly the kind of feedback that I appreciate. And I've appreciated, incidentally, Barry's comments on the website in recent days and weeks, and sorry that I haven't had a chance to respond to them directly. I think I'll conclude there. I don't think any of us underestimate the significance of some of these differences. It may well be that there are quite fundamental differences on things like the nature of the transition, but I don't think that we should skip to the end of the process and say, well, there's a fundamental difference, nothing doing here, we can't be unified in any kind of useful way. I think there are many steps to go through beyond that, and there is considerable scope for actually working out a lot of these questions, which are of fundamental importance, not just to the small groups involved in this process, but also for our movement as a whole. Thanks very much.
Unmuted. Thanks very much, Ed. Very good discussion. Loads of points covered and lots of points that still need to be discussed. I can see that there were other points raised in the chat about the nature of China, the question of work, the question of the state, the question of the association of producers, and so on. People wanting more information. Ed and I, who are representing TAS in these discussions, are approaching it, I think, in a very serious, you might say professional, rigorous way. We're being very patient, precisely because we think it is so important. And we do want to investigate, and we want to report back as much and as frequently and as much detail as we can. I think we would appreciate if people can understand that because we both have fairly demanding jobs, we're not always able to report back in the detail that is perhaps required, and we're aware that people might be getting report backs, say from for example, on the Weekly Worker or the CPGB online communist forum, which sometimes we have to say we don't recognize some of the things that are reported back. But having said that, they are being approached by all parties in a comradely and we think serious way, and people are watching, and that can only be good. We hope that something does come out of the talks. But if they don't actually lead to a fusion, as Ed said, we hope that other people have got interested and got involved, and we'll be able to continue these discussions, perhaps in a less formal way. But at the moment, our eye is on the prize. And can I finish, please, by just encouraging, if you think that the way that we approach these subjects, whether you agree or disagree with us, but whether you think that the way that we're approaching it, I mean, is a valid contribution to the revolutionary left, to the Marxist left, and you want to help us and get involved, then please do consider joining TAS. You can do that by filling in the form on the website. We do ask for a subscription, a sub. If you're working, it is a minimum of £5 a week. If you're on benefit, then that's open to negotiation, but a minimal amount. But we would like to have more members. We would like to have you involved. So please do get in touch. With that, I'm going to close the meeting. I'm going to say thank you very much to Ed, and thank you very much to everybody who spoke, and thank you to everybody who attended. We don't have a program to announce now, but we'll be working on that, and we will send it out in the course of the next week, certainly before the fortnight's meeting in 2 weeks' time. Yeah. And with that, can I say thank you very much, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Good night.